Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I would like to talk about a very famous book, an American book or perhaps a French book or quite simply a world literature book. A book written, published in 1933. The name of the writer is Gertrude Stein and the name of the book is The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Now, you may have heard, of course, of Gertrude Stein because she is still, she's long dead, but she is and was a figure of modernist writing and of the modernist era in Paris. Now, Gertrude Stein was born in America, but she emigrated to France in her late teens, I think, right at the beginning of her 20s perhaps. She emigrated to Paris with her brother. And she stayed in Paris until her death in 1946. Now, Gertrude Stein, we'll come back to her writings in a second, of course, is just as famous, perhaps, for the support that she showed nascent artists and paintings in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century. So she arrived in Paris before the First World War already, and that's when she started to patron, to give money to support, to encourage, and to buy works from people who at that time were completely unknown, people like Picasso, Matisse, Cézanne, Juan Gris, all those nowadays, of course, extremely famous people. And her house, there are a couple of photographs of her house and famous photos because her house was full of paintings. In fact, fun fact probably, she does complain somewhere else that the paintings were hardly visible because, of course, they had electricity only installed later on. And so right from the beginning, they only had candles to see paintings at the light off. And as you know, candles are notoriously a problem to look at paintings with, quite simply because any whiff of wind will make the flame goes that way, and of course you won't be able to see very much of the painting. Plus you couldn't see the paintings at the top of the wall. Anyway, that was Gertrude Stein, who basically supported all those artists and bought tons of their paintings to help them out in the beginning. She's also very famous because among her two greatest friends were Picasso, the painter, of course, and Hemingway, the American writer. Now, she went on to stay in France, and during the First World War, she stayed in Paris, and then with Alice, her companion, her wife, they had a little stint in driving ambulances to help the war effort. In the Second World War, she still was in France. She retreated to a very rural area, a period that was perhaps a little bit tainted by the fact that she seems to have been held by a non-collaborator later on. Now, of course, she wasn't pro-Nazi or pro-German or anything, but she, let's say, didn't really voice any, protest at the Pétain regime, the one that took over France during wartime and who collaborated with the Germans. Now, what's left today of Gertrude Stein's work? Well, I'm sure most of it is still in print, or a lot of it is still in print. Probably like then, now, very little of it is actually read by people. And we'll come to that in a second. There are some very good reasons for this. Personally, I can only say that what she considered her masterpiece, The Making of Americans, a 1925 book, more than 1,000 pages, I had a look at it. I just couldn't get into it. She wrote 3 lives, 3 novellas, really, in 1909. And this is, to my taste, of course, much more palatable. I really like this one. I really like Melanctha, one of the 3 lives, about a black woman. I think really, really beautiful little text. A text which, incidentally, Susan Sontag says in her diaries is her favorite from Gertrude Stein. I'm not sure it's my favorite, but that's Susan Sontag, who am I to disagree? Something that is still accessible is Wars I Have Seen, which is basically her sort of memoirs of the time spent in France during the war, the Second World War, and that's pretty accessible as well. There are things that I tried and just couldn't get through at all. Tender Buttons poetry is just beyond me. Geography and Play, I also had a look at it and I gave up very quickly. And probably the most accessible work, the easiest work to read by Gertrude Stein is the one for today, the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Now, we want to say a couple of things about this book, and basically I would like to talk about three different aspects very, very briefly. The first one is to do with the title, the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, and that sort of dichotomy, biography, autobiography, and to what effect is it used in this one. Second, of course, you cannot talk about Gertrude Stein without saying a word about the style in which she writes, and that is something that we, of course, need to give a quick look at. And finally, we'll say a word about why this work is also so interesting beyond itself, as it were. You don't really need to be interested in either her, Gertrude Stein, or her companion, Alice B. Toklas, to find many, many interesting little things in this book, which, I remind you, is basically taking place in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century, a very creative, artistically speaking, period, certainly, if there was one. Now, let's talk by perhaps let's start with this first point about autobiography and biography. Why? Well, why? Quite simply because is a book called The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. By definition, an autobiography, auto, self, an autobiography will be written by the one whose life is being described in the book. If I write my autobiography, it will be, you know, the narrative of my life, not yours, not anybody else's. Well, of course, it is the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, but the subject of the book is Gertrude Stein herself. And in fact, no surprise, since Gertrude Stein wrote that book. In other words, under the guise of writing the life of Alice from Alice's perspective, she actually writes the life of, well, both of them together, but mostly Gertrude Stein, from a perspective of Gertrude Stein. What is interesting stylistically is that the narrator in the book talks about Gertrude Stein in the third person. So the book will say something like, yesterday Gertrude Stein went out and bought Picasso, or she liked to do this, or she would write that way. But essentially, at the end of the book, you know like nothing about Alice B. Toklas. It is certainly not an autobiography of hers, or an autobiography of her. It is not a biography of Alice B. Toklas. It is solely and entirely a book about Gertrude Stein. Now, this produces, of course, a very interesting effect, because in the beginning you think, well, I'm going to get the life from that side kick, as it were, because Alice herself, she wrote a couple of cookbooks and some memoirs later on in her life after the death of Gertrude. But Alice, for, I don't know, something like 40 years, close on 40 years, she was the ever-present, ever sort of silent companion to Gertrude Stein. They were a homosexual couple. And she was noted at the time for being, well, ever-present but ever-silent, taking care of everything, and basically making it possible for Gertrude to concentrate entirely on her own artistic creations, writing, novels, short stories. But that we really don't get an idea about from that book, because again, the book is entirely about Gertrude Stein. And so we have this sort of separation between the two things. We are looking at the object as if we are looking at an external object, Gertrude Stein, that writer, but actually the one doing the describing pretends to be at a distance because it is the same as the object being described. This sort of distanciation between the two still produces the effect of looking at Gertrude Stein from the outside and making us forget, quite frankly, most of the time, that in fact the one doing the describing is Gertrude Stein herself. sounds complex like this, but it's actually very, very simple. It's quite simply that she tries to prevent what we are very quick to do when we read an autobiography, which is quite simply to accept that the person knows everything about herself and is telling us everything about herself. And there can be no critical look at what she did or wanted. Whether that is the case in that novel is of course debatable. That depends on the image that you have of Gertrude Stein. She is not very critical of her work, if one can put it like this. But yeah, after all, she is writing about herself, so she can say what she wants to say about herself. Now, a couple of course, examples that came to me when I was thinking about this subject of books done that way is immediately Martin Amis' his book Experience. Now, Experience on the surface is an autobiography. And of course, you do learn a couple of things about Martin Amis, but in retrospect, you learn very little about him, and you learn a lot more about his father. Martin Amis's father was a writer himself, a very, very famous writer in the 60s, 70s, 80s in England, 1970s, 60s. And so really it is about his father, his relationship with his father's very famous friends like Philip Larkin at the time, for example. And it is really at the end of it, not really an autobiography or a set of memoirs from Martin Amis. It is much more about a time, another person, and the relationship with that person. And if you read Martin Amis's experience to know what he thought or how he wrote or whatever, you will be disappointed because it's not really in the book. Now, of course, a novel that I think is well known is Autobiography of My Mother by the Jamaican-American writer Jamaica Kincaid. She's not Jamaican, I'm sorry. Jamaica Kincaid. And it's the same, of course, the title says it all, Autobiography of My Mother, right? So here ostensibly, Kincaid talks about a woman, but we realize that, of course, it is the mother is the daughter is the mother. In fact, it is perhaps one of the aspects of the novel that this repetition down time and through slavery of identity and how to escape it. A wonderful novel. As a Frenchman, I had to think about Nathalie Sarraute. Probably not very, very read these days, Nathalie Sarraute, but she was huge for a while. And she wrote an autobiography, or memoirs really, called Enfance, childhood, where she talks to herself when she was, I think, 11 or 12. So she talks to her double, but her younger double. And she addresses herself as you, tu. So instead of saying I, she says tu. In other words, again, introducing a distanciation as if she would be able to, or wanted to, probably examine herself from a distance instead of being caught up in her own identity. Michael Frayn, a wonderful English writer, did kind of the same. He has a book on his father, My Father's Fortune, it's called. And well, it is a little bit about Michael Frayn, but it is again a way of talking Michael Frayn incidentally, and it's much more about his father and their relationship also. A masterpiece, finally, in that line, although again it's not like Gertrude Stein really in that sense. It is, of course, the fantastic Edmund Gosse's Father and Son, a masterpiece of memoir, in which Gosse, while talking about himself, says really a lot more about his father to some extent and the world of his father. It's an extraordinary book. And at the end of the book, well, yeah, you learn that Edmund Gosse aspired to be a romantic poet, but you don't really know that very much about him. But that's fine, because the book is not supposed to be an autobiography. It is supposed to be a relationship, about a relationship, and through both, of course, you learn about both the writer and the object of his writing. Now, since that approach is not entirely unknown, even though Gertrude Stein seems to have, have originated it a bit, what makes her special is, of course, the style. Now, it's impossible to describe Gertrude Stein's style except in some sort of general way. So I'll try to put some examples of it on the screen. You can stop, of course, the video and just read the excerpt for yourself. Basically, perhaps we could say that she wanted to emulate speech. Now, that sounds terribly off when you read her, because it doesn't read like speech exactly, and certainly it's nothing to do with formal informal, that is imitating spoken language as opposed to the more formal aspect of literary writing, for example. What I mean by that is that she perhaps imitates or refers to the way when we speak, we do not necessarily follow a very straight line, we repeat a lot of the words we use, we hesitate. Hesitations and the like have nothing to do with our text, it's not at all in it. So there is this quality of somebody speaking or thinking out loud. At the same time, she was an experimental writer, which means that she can repeat words, sentences, ideas 1,000 times a minute.
If I told him a completed portrait of Picasso, if I told him, would he like it? Would he like it if I told him? Would he like it? Would Napoleon? Would Napoleon? Would he like it? If Napoleon, if I told him, if Napoleon, would he like it if I told him? If I told him, if Napoleon? Would he like it if Napoleon, if I told him? If I told him, if Napoleon, if I told him? If I told him, would he like it? Would he like it if I told him? Now, not now, and now. Now, exactly as a king.
Use the same 5 words 10 different ways, 100 times. And it can be extremely, not only difficult to read, but hardly comprehensible, as far as I'm concerned. Very humbly, I have to say that sometimes it's almost impossible to understand what she's getting at, and also because the writing style itself doesn't make it easy to focus on the meaning, because the form is so exploded, is so fragmented, and is so overwhelming at times. So that's the thing. T.S. Eliot, in his in a letter he sent to somebody, the first taste he got of Gertrude Stein, he says something like, "It seems nonsense to me," and that is probably the impression you may have if you've never read her, that it's just nonsense. It's just somebody doing something that anybody could do. Now remember, she was a supporter of Picasso, of Matisse. And remember, of course, that those painters did not, as Picasso says somewhere, we didn't decide to invent Cubism. We were looking for a new way to express ourselves. And that is exactly, of course, what many modernists were doing at the time, and certainly what Gertrude Stein was trying to do. She was trying to change literature, to invent a new way of writing. And just like Picasso, just like Matisse, the question is, well, it's always been done that way, but why? Shouldn't it be done some other way? Picasso can ask himself, what is to represent, what is to show, a chair, a woman, a hotel, whatever. And that is exactly, of course, what Gertrude Stein asked herself. The main question at the time, I think, is, of course, what is representation in the arts, and is the way we've done it so far the only way to do it? What is, in fact, to represent the world? Is it possible to represent the world? What do you represent of it, and how? So, again, it's the first time you look at a text by Gertrude Stein, depending on what text it is, it can be extremely bewildering. And an experience that you don't want to repeat, that you simply cannot get into the text. Now, personally, I have that with some text, as I said, standard buttons, geography and place, for example, which I find exceedingly difficult and impossible to get through. I just can't. But works like the Autobiography of Alice B, or Wars I Have Seen, or about her experiences in Second World War, those are much easier to read because they are almost written for mass consumption, one would say. In fact, I think that it's Alice who alludes to that in one of her sort of memoirs written later on, that in fact, of course, Gertrude Stein was finding absolutely zero success with everything she was writing. It was exceedingly difficult for her to be published. Nobody wanted to publish her. People were making fun of her. I'll try to put a very, very nice reply from one publisher she had approached, who rejected her by trying to imitate her style. That's what is funny about this reply. And so she basically self-edited and also at some stage tried to do something more accessible to draw people in her work. So today, the Autobiography of Alice B is still a classic. It's still in print. It's still, I guess, read a bit. For the rest of the work, I think it's probably doubtful that many people engage with it in a very, very sort of natural way, that is outside of academia, or because they have to, or of course, there will be people who fall in love completely with it. I have to say that I echo, very humbly, T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, in another letter, does acknowledge that he's not sure he understands everything, but it does have a hypnotic effect on him. And that's exactly what the effect I get as well, sort of trance-like almost. If you let yourself be carried away by, or carried by the narrative and the sort of repetitions, and you think perhaps in more oral terms and oral literature terms, and you let yourself just be washed away with all those very rhythmic sentences, you can attain some sort of trance-like, hypnotized-like state, which is rare, I think, in literature. It's certainly an experience. If you can get to that point, that is extremely rewarding. Now, this really is, do not forget, not simply for show or not because she wanted to be original. She was dedicated to finding new ways of expressing oneself in writing. And when we don't forget that aspect, of course, we don't stop and do what many people have done over the years, and certainly at the time, which is ridicule her for writing in that way. You may find it really ridiculous. You might find it impenetrable. But remember, she wasn't doing it because she didn't have anything else to do. She was doing it because she had a purpose. Whether she reached that purpose, whether she achieved what she wanted to achieve, is of course open for debate. Is she readable? It's very difficult to say. Certainly it's a minority who will enjoy her work. But this Autobiography of Alice B is highly accessible and will give you just a taste of what her most difficult work can be. Now, finally, of course, one word on the setting. Setting is Paris from just before the First World War until 1946. A time during which, as I said in the beginning, she invested a lot of time and effort in supporting artists who were completely struggling at the time. Matisse, the great Matisse, says in his, it's not autobiography, I think it's a book of interviews, I can't remember exactly, says that for years, but literally years, he didn't sell one painting. For years, didn't sell one of them. He had to support by teaching drawing, which he hated. His wife was working, etc. And yeah, you may smile, but this is, of course, 120 years ago. And so, of course, Picasso, it was the same. Picasso was completely unknown when he arrived from Spain. He didn't sell anything, wouldn't sell anything. Cézanne, the Manet that she bought, the Toulouse-Lautrec that she bought. Of course, all those people at that time were still completely, well, Cézanne perhaps not, but they were completely unknown, wouldn't sell anything to anybody. So, of course, she got them all on the cheap. Well, not on the cheap, that's relative notion, of course. She got them for, in fact, an inflated price at the time, because basically she would buy those paintings because she loved them, because she believed in that new way of representing the world, and also to help them out, because most of them, if not all of them, were always in great financial difficulties. Obviously, that will change, certainly for Picasso, who will become notoriously wealthy. But this is the type of environment you have right on the cusp of the First World War, this incredible artistic world of 1900, 1910. She goes to London. She will go to America after the First World War for a series of lectures, quite famous one. And she meets everybody. Of course, she meets T.S. Eliot. She meets Wyndham Lewis. She meets James Joyce. Didn't produce anything, but she did meet him. She, of course, is a great friend of Hemingway's. And all the Americans, remember, the Americans were drawn to Paris between 1900 and, let's say, 1930. All of them came. And of course, all of them went to see Gertrude Stein because she was very famous, even though she was probably unknown by the majority of the population. Within the literary circles, within the artistic circles, she was known both for the work she was doing and, of course, the paintings and painters she was surrounding herself with. So if you are interested in that incredible world of about 100 years ago, a period of incredible creation, renewal, modernism, just new things happening left, right, and center. Of course, on the other side of the channel, you had that revolution as well taking place, the Virginia Woolf, and T.S. Eliot, and the like. Ezra Pound. But we, of course, the French had the same in Paris, fed by many Americans what was coming out of England, of course, and Spain and Italy and all the countries around, meeting in Paris and creating something never seen before. And this is certainly, now, it is not a book of memories of describing all those aspects, obviously, but because she was so intimately linked with all those aspects and all those people and creators, they are on every page. If you are interested in this period, the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas is certainly a good starting point. Now, in conclusion, the one thing you may know Gertrude Stein for is one line. The line goes, "A rose is a rose is a rose." It's unfortunate, perhaps, that she's only remembered for that, or for those very famous pictures of her, or for, I don't know, writing impenetrable prose. Because, in fact, she was not only a very interesting person in herself, I think, by all accounts, extremely well read, very smart, very, very strong personality. She was, yes, in a homosexual couple, even though she never really promoted homosexuality as such. It was just that, and there was no real fuss to be made about it. You can think here, you can relate it to the Bloomsbury set in England at the same time, where homosexuality was just a fact of many of them, Lytton Strachey, people like that. So she was never a campaigner for any of those things. She was simply content to try to be something new, do something new, and support any sort of new creation taking place at the time. And for that, and for many aspects of her writing, she really deserves to be not only remembered, but read. And again, the best place to start, it really is the Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which I think really deserves a reread. You may find it impossible to get through. You may be put off at first. Persevere. Do not give up. Give her a good 30, 40, 50 pages. Try to get into the rhythm of it, and hopefully you will be richly rewarded at the end. Bye-bye.